Hey, Science 20s. Okay, so now we're down to the nitrogen cycle. This is the last of the different cycles that happen in biology on Earth. If you're filling in the notes, I've heard there's some formatting issues with it. You have to open it in Google Docs. I think if you try to open it as a Word document, it might get a little screwy. And that's just because it was created in a different program than Word. So just keep that in mind if the formatting of the fill in the notes isn't working for you. Okay, so the nitrogen cycle is kind of complicated, but we're just going to talk about it in general senses. And it's one that we're really disconnected from nitrogen because we don't think of nitrogen as something super important. All of us, everything that's alive, needs nitrogen to keep cells functioning. One of the main building blocks within cells is proteins. And proteins need nitrogens in order for a protein to be made. Now, it's an absolute majority in the atmosphere. Most of the air on Earth is nitrogen, but all of the cells in a human body, and even in just about any other cell that's alive, doesn't actually use nitrogen, like at all. Like doesn't use nitrogen at 0%. So we indirectly use nitrogen. I don't know if you've seen the movie Interstellar with Matthew McConaughey. The reason why the blight is affecting Earth in that movie is that it's a type of fungus that is living off of nitrogen instead of oxygen, and that's why it's growing so quickly. That's one of the reasons why the crops are failing and they have to burn everything in that movie Interstellar. So hopefully that doesn't happen. So how does nitrogen get used by us? It starts with bacteria in the soil. Bacteria in the soil use nitrogen and turn that gas, they can use it, into a byproduct called nitrates. Nitrates are basically fertilizers for plants. Okay? So when we eat plant material or other animals eat plant material, that's how they get nitrogen into their body. That's how it creates proteins that we need to survive. So if an animal eats grass and we eat that animal, inadvertently, if we eat a steak, we're getting the nitrogen from that animal that it got at one point or another from plant matter. And plant matter got that nitrogen from bacteria. Bacteria create nitrates. Very cool. Now, there's a second type of bacteria in the soil, because how does nitrogen get back into the atmosphere? A second type of bacteria called denitrifying bacteria take that nitrogen in nitrate and turn it back into a gas. So you do have this cyclical thing in soil. It's a little bit different in the ocean, but we still use decomposers and we still use bacteria. Okay, so we'll talk about that. The video is going to be linked in the notepad today. Now, humans can really mess with the nitrogen cycle because through the use of fertilizers. Now, I'm not going to knock fertilizers very much. They have created, and the amount of food on Earth isn't possible at all without fertilizers. A lot of studies look at the amount of food production on Earth, and without nitrate fertilizers or ammonia fertilizers that use nitrogen that humans have created in a lab, in factories, we would lose 25 to 50% of the food that we eat. So there's not enough food being made on Earth without artificial fertilizers. There's just not enough. There's not enough nitrogen. But one of the byproducts is runoff of nitrogen in fertilizers that get into water. These fertilizers that get into water, they cause something called an algal bloom or an algae bloom, and that's where we can get all that kind of really mucky, gross green stuff. Sometimes it's got different colors, and you get really dangerous algae called blue-green algae, which is toxic. It was heartbreaking last year around this time, springtime, and then in the summer in the States. There were scores of dogs that were dying every day from blue-green algae poisoning. Dogs would go play in a pond, and they would die within hours because the blue-green algae is so toxic. And it can absolutely kill humans too. So when there's blue-green algae warnings, you got to stay away from that. It's toxic. It can kill you. And inadvertently, fertilizers that get into aquatic systems can speed up the growth factor of algae. Now, algal blooms go through a cycle of rapid growth. So you have all of this algae that grows really, really, really quickly. And that's not necessarily a bad thing because algae produces oxygen. The problem is that the algae has a short life cycle, and all of that algae really shouldn't be there. Naturally, without all the extra fertilizer, only a small amount of algae will grow. If you feed it, it grows really, really quickly, and then when the runoff is gone, there's no more food for it, no more nitrates, and it dies. And when it dies, the decomposers in lakes and rivers go mental and start eating all the dead algae, and that requires oxygen. It requires oxygen to decompose algae, and that creates massive deficits of oxygen within those waterways. So you have a problem of the algae overgrowing a lake, potentially suffocating the fish in there because there's just too much algae. But a bigger problem is when the algae starts to die, the decomposers will suck all of the oxygen out of the lake or the river and kill the fish and kill the other organisms that need more oxygen. Okay, so that's the last cycle. Now, all of the things that humans do along with that affect the different cycles, but also on top of that, like deforestation, urban sprawl, like building into where animals live, it creates problems within ecological systems and puts different species at risk. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about this today, and we'll leave the project that we're going to be doing next week about species that have gone extinct or extirpated till next week. But I just want to talk about this last slide. Okay. Now, all of the different cycles are natural. They get on without our help, but humans, just by our presence on Earth, and it's not because we're mostly, I'm not going to say it's because we're malicious and we want to hurt animals. It's just this is how we live and survive. We affect them. And it is causing so many more animals to go extinct. And the main reason is humans have just adapted faster than all of the other animals on Earth because of our big brains and our technology. So the biologists estimate the animals go extinct all the time, right? Okay, so before I get to that number, it is an absolute fact that animals go extinct all the time. In fact, 99.9% of all animals that have ever existed on Earth have gone extinct. The only animals that are on Earth are the greatest survivors of all of the generations that came before. But the amount of extinctions that are occurring is not natural. It's different than what has happened in the past, and it's because of humans. It's about 1,000 times higher. Now, there have been mass extinctions in the past where, like, think of the dinosaurs getting smoked by the asteroid. This point in time, it's very scary to talk about it, but we are living in a mass extinction event. And the mass extinction event is not caused by an asteroid. It's not caused by supervolcanoes. It's caused by us. So it's happening. You can count the species that are dying. Biologists are doing it, and they're raising alarms about it. So this is bigger than just climate change. So you can say, yeah, the climate's changing. That's definitely stressing animals out. True. That's one small piece of the puzzle. You have human pollution. Overhunting. Humans have hunted animals to extinction because we created things like bow and arrow and guns. Things that can hunt animals that we would never really be able to catch before, or it would be very difficult to kill. I don't know if you've seen a moose before, up close, and if you've ever shot a bow and arrow before or sharpened up a stick to make a spear. Bringing down a moose is going to be kind of tough, but it's very easy if you have a gun. And I'm not saying guns are bad. I'm just saying that before humans realized what was happening with different animal species, we hunted them to extinction. Whales are a good example. Once we figured out how to make harpoons and the techniques to get whales, we were able to scoop them out of the ocean at a rate that they couldn't replenish themselves, and they almost all went extinct. Can you imagine that? Like in the early 1900s, they were at levels where if we kept hunting them, you would have been living in a world where they would have been in picture books, like not existed. It's terrifying. Also, we've inadvertently moved species around the world. So we'll talk about invasive species next week. There are species that do really, really well in new areas they're brought to, and they take over. But when they take over the area, they take over the area that animals use for food and breeding and living, and kind of like kill the rest of the animals in that area. Disease is a big problem, right? So there's this time we're living in. It's very difficult to talk about because it's kind of scary and it's kind of sad. This is a mass extinction event. Most mass extinction events occur over like 10,000 years. 10,000 years, like oh yeah, like all these animals went extinct over about 10,000 years. We're talking about over like 1,000 years. So it's happening so much faster than what Mother Nature could do. Even a freaking asteroid strike. That took a long time to kill all the dinosaurs. It's not like they all died the next day. They died within thousands of years. We are killing animals potentially faster than a giant rock from outer space. So, how can we change this? Well, we're going to talk about that next week. Some things we can change, some things we can't. Some things maybe we don't want to give up. All right, that's the lesson for today. The big one is about the nitrogen cycle. Remember, due at the end of this week is the ecological project, and there'll be a new one next week that we're going to be working on. And hopefully, I don't know if you guys like biology. It's a little bit different than what we've been talking about. I think it's cool. All right, that's that, guys. Have a good weekend.